The proportions in the world, as I showed in the TED talk, are fairly easy to see from space. What you see in brown is generally desertifying, and it's by far the greatest areas of the world. What you see in pale green is often desertifying as well. Okay? And it's only really the much darker green areas that are. So most of the world's land, we're in trouble because of agriculture. Now that desertification of that land, as we know, has been blamed on livestock. More recently, for the methane they put out, we used to hear that 50 years ago, now we do, and they've been blamed for climate change, etc. And this was common knowledge. This is what I grew up knowing, and everybody has known this for thousands of years. I'm told you can go back in ancient Hebrew texts and see them blaming the pastoralists for the desertification. And that was said to be because of overgrazing, overstocking. Now, as I showed in the TED talk, clearly that was not true, because when we look at research stations, and there are many in different countries, and I looked at the ones over most of the United States because that's where range science developed. And what we find is where there's no overgrazing occurring, desertification is severe. So all this blaming for 10,000 years on overgrazing obviously wasn't right. And we could see that on our research stations, but we scientists interpret the data to fit our beliefs. We don't shift our beliefs when the data isn't fitting them, because we're human. And the caption to that read that this livestock had been included in the 1950s, but processes resulting in the replacement of grasses with shrubs, etc., continued. What processes? You see, we just didn't know. Now, instead of getting inquiring minds and saying, clearly something is causing this and it's not overgrazing, tragically through our educational system, as one Australian put it well, we now have cage-bred scientists, not free range, and they don't get out there on the land, looking at the land and asking questions, and that's what science should be about, is questioning and arguing and asking. Instead of now, we're just looking at computers and published papers and peer-reviewed papers, and if it's not there, it's not true. We've ceased to ask the questions we needed to ask. Nobody's at fault, it's just the way our education has gone. And then, as I pointed out in the TED talk, I got a shock when I found national parks like this in the United States, where there'd been no livestock, no overgrazing for 70, 80 years. So again, how can we keep blaming overgrazing? Obviously, it's not right. There's something else going on. And these areas where we rest the land, like those research plots and this national park, it was inconceivable to us that that could be what's causing desertification. Resting the land. That's just totally counterintuitive. So we couldn't interpret what we were seeing. Now, this is not true of all of the world, because when you look at the past civilizations, when agriculture destroyed the civilizations, in the green areas of the world, we find them under jungle. In other words, when rested, biodiversity fully recovered. So if you rest lakes, oceans, perennially humid environments, it is the most powerful tool available to us to restore the full functioning of our environment. But when you get to these seasonal precipitation environment, it flips. And it's probably the most destructive tool known to us. Now you begin to see why conservation is working in some parts of the world, not working in others. Now, what is it that kills the grass? Frankly, it is just in the absence of animals, with nothing to remove the top every year, trees shed their leaves or are evergreen. Grasses aren't evergreen in these climates that I'm talking about, and they can't shed their own leaves. So if nothing takes the leaf off, it shifts from biological breakdown to chemical, physical weathering. oxidation, as you see on this long rested site. Now that's in an arid area, but what about high rainfall areas? Same thing occurs if it's very seasonal, where you get 3, 4, 5 months of humidity and then 6 months, 8 months or whatever of dryness. And here we have very long grassland just oxidizing where nothing removes that leaf. So we can understand, and we understood that about 10,000 years ago. And then it occurs also when you get to areas like Canada and so on, where a rested grassland like this, all the grass is died, oxidized, and nature is always filling a vacuum. In the earlier pictures, nature's filling the vacuum with algae and crusted soil between the plants. In the higher rainfall one I showed you, nature's filling the vacuum with shrubs and trees, tap-rooted plants, and here it's filling it with a tap-rooted thistle. Nature will always try and fill a vacuum. But the point I'm making is that rested grasslands tend to die. Now the overgrazing of plants part of this equation, you can see partly where we went wrong. And I'm not being critical of anybody, all right? Who do you criticize for not flying before the Wright brothers did? Somebody must have been guilty. Okay, I'm just building on 10,000 years of failures. My own failures, the failures of range science. If we didn't have these failures, we couldn't build on them. The Wright brothers, when they flew on a given day, were building on the failures of thousands of people that had died trying to learn to fly. So it's not critical of anybody. It's just critical of how slow we are to learn as humans. And this is how we advance. So for years, and you'll see it throughout the range science profession, you'll see papers about overgrazed land. Governments have regulations, laws. Some countries, they jail people for overgrazing land. Just think about it logically. Can you overgraze land? No, you can't. All you can overgraze or graze is plants. And a Frenchman gave us the first clues to this in 1959. He was a pasture researcher in France, and he discovered that overgrazing of plants had nothing to do with animal numbers. Everything to do with time. Time of exposure, re-exposure, nothing to do with numbers. Whether you have 1 cow or 1 million makes no difference, except to the number of plants overgrazed. But to the fact of overgrazing, it's just time. If the 1 million cows are there for 3 days, no plants are overgrazed. If 1 cow's there for 15 days, plants are overgrazed. So it was a time factor, not a numbers game. Now that was published in 5 major European languages, picked up immediately by independent scientists whose salaries are not paid by institutions around the world. Can you name any cattlemen's organization, university, government agency, environmental organization in the world that's accepted that yet? 60 years later? We'll talk about these blockages to the advancement of science later. But that has never been refuted, and it's good, sound science. Now, when we look at climate change, the grasslands are by far the largest areas of the world. Everybody's talking about planting trees. That's wonderful, but trees can't address the climate change anywhere like grasslands can, because trees are a critical part of the ambient carbon cycling. You can't get off a carbon economy. Everything runs on carbon. Most of your body is carbon. All right, so trees play a critical role in cycling that carbon to keep all life going. The grasslands of the world play a critical role in storing the carbon in soil for thousands of years. So they are why we're focusing on these in our strategy to try and lead forward. Now, when we look at this, as I mentioned, range scientists report very little difference in soil organic carbon between grazed and ungrazed land. Now, this faulty research is endangering all of us. Why? Because the grasslands are the place where we can store most of the carbon. But they're reporting that there's almost no difference whether you rest the land or graze it. The mistake came from talking about and writing papers about grazing land instead of grazing plants. So let's look at this. What does it really mean to talk about research that shows no difference between grazed and ungrazed land? What it really means is that there's little difference between those two bits of land in the carbon stored in the soil. Looking at that, would you expect any difference? Now, one side of that, everything that we want to do in the Western world is being practiced. No livestock, no overgrazing of plants. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent on soil conservation measures. It's managed by the US National Park Service. The other side of that is everything we're condemning. Ignorance, stupidity, greed. It's Navajo land, overstocking, overgrazing. They've had these totally opposite practices. At the time I took that picture, for about 70 years at least. Can you tell me which side is which? Doesn't matter, does it? And of course there's no difference. Do you see where we went wrong? We didn't recognize that was rested land. Both sides there are rested land. One side is totally rested. The other side is partially rested at a very high level. There are so few sheep and animals on that land, there's nothing to disturb it. So you have partial and total rest, and that is the weight that is carrying that down. And that's what makes so much of that research now useless to us, which is tragic because people have spent a lot of time on it, very sincere people.